Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
All right, thank you, Chris. It's great to be here. I have, of course, a PowerPoint. Let me just go and get that. Although, as you'll see, I've tried to keep the amount of PowerPoint to a minimum. So I'm going to start with this little picture. So Tony and I were just talking about how spectacularly lovely Chicago looks today. I thought Chicago would be amazing buildings and bright sun and all the rest, and sure enough, and it's even windy, and I realise the windy city is to do with politics, but actually today it's actually windy as well, so it's everything I hoped. So I thought at least I could do is pay you back by giving you a picture of the Microsoft Research headquarters in Cambridge, and if you ever wanted to come and visit, it really is a lovely place. I'm sure you'd be very welcome. So as you can imagine, I'm probably let's be honest, a little bit nervous about opening the eScience workshop, and I think one of the challenges that those of you that have been who've been coming for several years, like Tony, must be very familiar with talking about is the fact that although on the one hand there probably isn't any area of science that isn't benefiting hugely from advances in computation, broadly defined, and also advances in sort of connectivity through the internet, broadly defined. On the other hand, probably take two scientists and they probably want very different things out of eScience. And so rather than try and give a false impression that I somehow have a really good understanding of eScience in general or strong opinions or an idea about strategy in that area, I'm just instead going to, I hope to illustrate how things seem to people like me who are in the world of environmental sciences and in particular trying to build predictive models of the environment. And then, but of course, I also have this weird and wonderful job for Microsoft, so I'm an ecologist at Microsoft, and so I'm also very excited that because of the wider picture that Microsoft sees, Microsoft has fingers involved in a lot of different areas of scientific computing. Of course, then we actually do start to see synergies at the same time. So although it is true that we want different things, at the same time, there's a lot actually that is in common. And I think that, it's just very exciting, I guess, to be exposed to that broader view. I'm going to start off just by illustrating some of the outputs from the group that I had in Cambridge. And then I'm going to come back to the question of why we would do that kind of work and why Microsoft would support that kind of work and how we've done it with tools in a second. So here's, there we go. It's the first demo I wanted to show you. This is, I think in terms of sort of scientific achievements from our group, this is the one at the moment that I'm the most proud of. I've been at Microsoft about 5.5 years, and I probably would have gone on to a faculty position otherwise, and I was writing my research statement about how we should really be able to understand the distribution of organisms in ecology from their interactions with each other in the environment. It's really the definition of ecology, but in fact, there wasn't one example where we could actually say this is why this particular type of species or this kind of organism has this distribution in terms of the underlying processes. So this is being visualized with a library called Dynamic Data Display through a browser. And what it's showing on the right here is the observed distribution of one kind of tree, in this case, northern temperate hardwoods in the eastern US. And on the left here is our model simulations. When we run the model, you should see, now it's not perfect because it's a genuine independent sort of test of whether it works. But this is quite a complicated individual-based simulator of forest dynamics that tracks thousands of individual trees. These trees grow and die and reproduce, and they shade each other and so on. And they compete with other kinds of trees. And what emerges is a distribution that approximates the one in reality. It's kind of, and again, given that this hadn't been done at all, this is quite an achievement for us. And we can see that for other species, for example, here. This is southern oaks, and we can see that the emergent distribution of those matches quite well the real one. This is on top of big maps here as well. And then with that model in place, we can do experiments like, in this case, removing competition. And so this is saying this is the distribution the oaks have in reality. But if we were to remove competition from other species, we can see that according to the simulations, they'd extend all the way up to the Canadian border, including the region where we are now, these southern oaks. So for the first time, we're able to actually estimate this. This is what we call the realized niche. That is the geographic distributions that species realize in reality. But this is the fundamental niche. This is where these species could form self-sustaining populations, if not for competition from other types of trees. As I said, though, forest ecology was very much my focus before, but what I'll show you is our group is moving on a little bit from there. So this, for example, is using that was my postdoc, Mark van der Velde's work. This is using those distributions then to estimate the impacts of climate change. And just to cut a long story short, the red and yellow areas are areas where this particular type of tree would expand into in a warming world, expect species to move north. And the dark blue are regions where we would expect that species to disappear due to climate change. And we've done something similar there in Spain. Now, this is also for forest communities, but this is not focusing on the trees or the plants. This is focusing on the bird communities. My postdoc, Tim Newbold, has done quite a sophisticated Bayesian analysis of the available data on how bird species respond to land use change from pristine through disturbed to intensely disturbed land in tropical forests. And the take-home point here is that different kinds of species, fruit eaters, nectar eaters, plant eaters, or migratory and non-migratory species show different responses. And this shows their response against generation length. So for example, birds that have a longer generation length respond more dramatically to land use change. And what he's done then is then combine that with thousands and thousands of data on the ranges of individual bird species. And then so what that means is across space, different forest communities support different communities of birds with different mixes of these different types. And then finally then, we've subjected those to the land use change and been able to make these maps of vulnerability. So we're able to say this Shannon is a measure of species diversity. This is the frugivores, the herbivores, and the insectivores. So we can actually make statements about how we think the bird communities would change under these land use change scenarios. So again, it's about the future. Moving still further away from forest communities, this is perhaps our scientifically most ambitious project at the moment. We call the Mattioli Model, and this is an attempt to build an individual-based simulator of ecosystems. So we take it for granted that we have global general circulation models with which we can simulate the possible future climate under different CO2 emission scenarios. Those models encode the fundamental processes of atmospheric dynamics in the Navier-Stokes equations and simulate them in a computer, and in so doing capture the broad aspects of the climate system and then how it might respond to perturbations. So what we're trying to do is a similar thing for ecosystems. And to cut a long story short, we're really simulating every individual organism on Earth, from the very smallest, microscopic things like rotifers, all the way up to the largest, like cows. And then obviously we have, the big things eat the smaller things and so on. These individuals grow and die and reproduce. And what emerges out of this is the structure of ecosystems like the trophic pyramid, the distribution of body sizes and so on. And the idea is with that kind of, and some geographic gradients, so with that kind of information in place, we should be able to have a more joined up kind of functional approach to managing biodiversity and ecosystem function, as opposed to the sort of correlational approach that we've been forced to adopt up to now. Here's moving from the natural, though, toward the human. This is, so what we've found is as we've tried to produce these predictive models of different aspects of the Earth system, you start to look at one thing and you realize that it's impinged by something else. So you can't do a decent treatment, for instance, of biodiversity without understanding land use change, which is the single largest threat to biodiversity. So this is a simulation of the potential future deforestation in the Amazon out to 2050, again, based on a large amount of data. And this model captures the inherent contagiousness of deforestation. So places that have already been deforested tend to act as a kind of catalyst for deforestation close by. I want to show you some very, very hot off the press kind of results. This is very simple, but when we think about something like land use change, it turns out the single largest pressure causing land use change is food production. So again, if we don't understand the future of global food production, we can't really understand land use change or biodiversity or carbon, etc. What I have here is, this thing is called Dataset Viewer. It's one of our tools. It's a little bit rough, actually. You could probably do with a revisiting. I'm sure we probably will as part of this initiative that we have across Research Connections, which I'll come back to close to the end. But anyway, it's a general viewer for, it's very good for netCDF files, sort of multi-dimensional, large geographical sort of data sets, really. And just here on my desktop, just to prove that it's, well, I suppose it doesn't prove, but hopefully give the impression that these are recent results. I'm going to take this thing here. Let me just... and just drop that into Dataset Viewer. And I'm expecting some, I'm pushing my laptop really hard today. I thought, why not? I'm expecting some oohs and ahs to see that incredible straight green line on the, up there on the screen. But that's because Dataset Viewer doesn't quite know what to do with this file, because what it has is predictions for the potential yield for each of the 11 staple crops around the world under climate change. And so it's indexed by latitude, longitude, but also crop and climate change. So what I'm going to do is slice it by crop, and then we get an even more impressive brown line. I'm going to slice that again by climate change scenario. And what's left is then indexed by latitude, longitude, and Dataset Viewer will guess to put that on a map. That's not the variable I want to look at. I want to look at yield per hectare. I'm just going to put that on a better. And so this tool is available for download. And although, as I say, it's a little bit rough around the edges, but I think it does seem to compare quite well with the alternatives like NASA's Panoply, for example. It's quite quick at dealing with fairly large data sets, and you can zoom in and out and so on. So I'm going to look at the, I happen to know that crop 5 is wheat there. And so, we could, for instance, have a look at China. And we can go forward and back there by climate change scenario and see the wheat yields in China declining and so on. And Dataset Viewer supports, you can have multiple views and you can change the color schemes and record videos and all that kind of stuff. So that may be one of the tools you might want to experiment with. And just like Chris said about the event, very, very interested in anyone's feedback and so on, because these are all things that are under development. I'm going to kill that now. And I think you might be relieved to know, mostly through my my little smorgasbord of results from our group then. So it comes back to this question. I gave a talk in Beijing recently. I'm going to keep this slide. That's why is it so in Mandarin Chinese, apparently. So why do we do that kind of work? And just to backtrack a little bit then, our focus is on what we call predictive modeling of the environment. So decision making in all areas of life are about anticipating the potential impact of the options we have on something that matters into the future. Whether that's crossing the street or planning where you're going to buy your house. And the same is true for decision-making about these environmental challenges that we face. We need to be able to provide those decision-makers with predictions for how important aspects of the environment, whether it's food, biodiversity, carbon, etc., would respond to the various policy or other types of levers that those decision-makers have at their disposal. Moreover, we need to be able to provide, to do that in a joined-up way, we need to be able to provide a set of these predictive models for all of the things that matter. It's amazing how much decision-making is still made in isolation in the area of the environment. One of the examples that really struck me fairly recently was biofuels, where the EU decided to support biofuels with a subsidy, and it should have been obvious that the impact was going to be that was going to take land away from food production, which was going to push up food prices, which was going to push up pressure on land use change, which was going to increase CO2 emissions. So that whole kind of joined up picture. But in fact, instead, that thought experiment was played out in reality rather than being anticipated. Having said that, it's easy to kind of poke fun at, I suppose, but at the same time, if they had turned around the EU and said, well, okay, we can see in general there are those links, can you provide the quantitative information so we can actually estimate the strengths of those links and so on, then the answer would have been no. And so we need to create a suite of these predictive models. An analogy that I often like to use, I know this might be really going back to basics, but is the idea that we've taken it for granted for a long time that we have reliable predictive models in mechanical engineering. So we design bridges or planes or cars, for instance, in silico. With a model of a bridge, we can say if we remove this strut, then the bridge would or wouldn't collapse and so on. But when we come into the area of the environment, we really can't do that. We can't say, well, if we were to remove this species, would the ecosystem collapse? We can't design ecosystems that are optimal, whether it's for food production, production of wood or fiber, or the production of food and so on. And here's a really big question then that we can't answer, which is how can we feed more people on the same amount of land with fewer inputs? I think this one question actually ties together so much of what we're facing in terms of the global environmental problems. Why do we need to feed more people? There's absolutely no doubt that there will be more people. We sometimes focus a lot on 2050 and beyond, us kind of earth scientists, I suppose. But when John Beddington, the government chief scientific advisor, although I think he might not be anymore, it just changed, but he was until recently, he chaired this foresight report into the future of food, which I'd really recommend. And he points out there that, in fact, if you just take a 15-year horizon, so not out to 2050, but a 15-year horizon, and then the uncertainties on population there are much smaller. So when you go out to 2050, of course, it depends on what you assume about demography. But out 15 years, there's very little uncertainty in the projections. And those projections show, for example, that there'll be 500 million extra people in sub-Saharan Africa alone. the least well-fed people in the world. There are going to be 500 million of them, probably living in 500, I'm going to have to do the maths, 1,000 cities of 500,000 each is what they think. There'll be 1,000 new cities of 500,000 people each. Somehow have to be fed in 15 years. So there'll be more people, the same amount of land. Well, the problem is that a lot of the land for food production that's good for food production has already been taken. So we're kind of going down the tail of less attractive places. The exception, the tropical forest, but tropical deforestation already creates 25% of CO2 emissions. And land use change is the single largest threat to biodiversity. And why do we need fewer inputs? So that's because up to now, the technologies that we've used to get more food out of farms has been entirely enabled by increased inputs. And so this is true, for instance, of obviously of the nitrogen input, but also the input of mechanization, irrigation, pesticides, and herbicides. So the Green Revolution was about finding a way to grow plants such that they could kind of benefit from an enormous increase in inputs made possible by the Industrial Revolution. And therefore, if we just extend the same approach into the future to try and get more out, then we're going to have ever more resource use, less water, and all the rest. So we really have to solve this problem. It's a huge problem in kind of predictive modeling of one kind or another. So I don't know if you saw on the agenda, but the title of my talk is Defensible Modeling of the Environment. So this, I think, is the real challenge, because the truth is it's actually quite easy, of course, to build models that predict things into the future. Most of the people here are probably quite technically savvy, and you could probably all spin up some kind of predictive modeling of whatever you wanted, but before the end of the day. The difficult thing is doing it well, and particularly I like this idea of defensible, because I think in a very real sense these predictions might have to stand up in court. The people that are making the decisions need to be convinced that the predictions of the model should be believed. And actually more than that, they actually have to be able to communicate the decisions they've made to the people that put them in power, whether it's customers or citizens that have put them in power through democracy. And so there's a real challenge then that says, it's not enough just to make predictions. We actually have to be able to explain to everyone where those predictions have come from, why these models are good, how we use data, that we need to have transparency and so on. And I know that a lot of those topics, I'm sure you've touched on over the years, and eScience has been concerned with from the beginning, actually, about enabling this kind of transparent approach. So that's mostly what I want to talk about today. And I think one of the key things that shapes all of our work, and all of the work I've showed you follows this kind of scheme, is that I think we now, from a sort of philosophical standpoint, know broadly how to do defensible modeling of the future. And we have most of the technical things in place to do it. So this is what I would call a kind of Bayesian approach to predictive modeling. And the idea is that we have different ideas about how the world works, we might call hypotheses, encoded in the shape of different models, competing models for the same process. And we have some data. And I know this will be familiar to a lot of people, so I won't go through it too slowly. But the idea is then we can use this general approach of Bayesian inference. And in so doing, then we can take the competing models and the data and put it through this process, and it creates two things. Firstly, it allows us to select from the several models, the one or two best models, or more technically, we can actually rank the probability of the different models if we want to. And for any models that we do select, we can generate a distribution of the parameters. And this contrasts with the way that actually most Earth science is done at the moment, at least in the predictive modeling part, which is that both the model structures and the parameters are just assigned by hand, and then manually adjusted a little bit until the results look plausible. But what the Bayesian inference lets us do is do this in a much more rigorous way. So for instance, we don't just get the best set of parameters, but we actually get a distribution, what's called a posterior distribution of parameters. So with our better model structures and our parameters, we can make predictions about the future. And importantly, we can put uncertainty on those predictions. And I think a big part of producing a model that is believable and defensible is to not pretend that the predictions are certain, but actually propagate both the structural and the parameter uncertainty into those predictions. And of course, to really enable this kind of defensible modeling to take off more generally, we shouldn't forget this part here, which is that the knowledge that we get from this kind of modeling actually feeds back into our hypotheses and our data gathering, or at least it should. The interesting thing is that I think we're still a long way from the point where the data that's gathered in the environmental sciences are routinely informed by the models that ultimately they need to supply. Each time NASA puts up a satellite, it's perhaps $300 million or so, and yet, and those satellites are informed by this process, but not in a kind of, it'd be nice if we could make that a little bit more rigorous and a bit more tight, because we can, using this pipeline, for example, we can alter the data and we can actually find out which of the data sources have the greatest impact on narrowing the uncertainty in the predictions or the uncertainty in the model structure. And that gives us a rigorous way to choose which data to go for next. And I don't think, in general, that's not done in the environmental sciences. And then also there's this part here, which is that those predictions with uncertainty then need to be communicated to decision makers. This is what I got when I put House of Commons. I think it's perhaps changed a little bit since then, with the emphasis being on the little. And of course, those decision makers need to communicate their decisions to the populace, which I think has also changed a little bit since Hogarth's day, a little. And I think that leads us quite naturally onto one other thing, which is, of course, that this process, it's very important that this process is not monolithic. I mentioned those two aspects of what I understand of e-science as being the advances in the computational technology as applied to science on the one hand, and the kind of connectivity between people on the other. And to really make this work, we need to enable as much creativity as possible. At the moment, we're limited often by the technical steps, whereas we'd like instead to be limited by people's creativity in thinking up new hypotheses and making sense of data, et cetera, et cetera. What this means, we need some way to sort of, and it's difficult to draw on the board, but we need some way to enable this pipeline to be shared as a sort of social thing between scientists so that we can routinely share models, interrogate each other's models, and alter them and build off them and so on. And again, of course, there are examples of that at the moment, but it's not nearly as much as it could be. One example is the general circulation models. There are at least 16 that the IPCC thinks are good enough to put into their reports. But no one can actually go across those models and, for instance, take the ocean model from one model and the atmosphere from another. And so we really don't have this ability to kind of mash up, if you like, our various ideas and models to find the best model out of a community of competing models. And part of that is what I use this phrase long tail a lot, which I think is perhaps misunderstood sometimes, but you would have heard of it in other areas of culture, which is that the internet can enable these smaller groups of people to do various things. So they use it in music, for example, to say that the internet has enabled smaller bands do more niche music, of course, to reach their audiences across the world. And I think as applied to science, the way I like to think of it is that most of the important advances, or a lot of the important advances in the environmental sciences, come out of groups of 1 or 2 or 3 people working on their laptops and PCs and all that kind of stuff. And at the moment, those people typically, a lot of them aren't technically savvy enough to really take advantage of a lot of what is available. And so if instead if we could take all the intermediate steps that those small groups tend to stumble over, then we could enable those groups of 2 or 3 scientists that are very creative to contribute to the bigger picture. So at the moment, for example, it's very hard as a scientist if you make a new finding about something in the Earth system to get that into a general circulation model. I mean, that would be an enormous endeavor. It would be a kind of endeavor in lobbying the people that do those models. Whereas in principle, wouldn't it be nice if ideally, a kind of utopian vision, I suppose, but if everything was so open that actually they could just go and download that entire GCM, switch out their new finding into it? Wouldn't it be nice if the end point of a PhD, for example, like a PhD defense, wasn't just a couple of tentative conclusions, but it was actually a simulation of the global Earth system with those new findings from that PhD in there? So just to illustrate this a little bit, the most important project to us, I think, to date has been this new model of the terrestrial carbon cycle. So I just want to go over the background to that a little bit. I'm also going to check the time. Am I halfway through? I think so, right? Okay, good. Does that mean it's time to have a break and play the accordion? I suppose it is, really. Now, I should point out that, as I explained to Chris earlier, I think it's great that she did this. Actually, firstly, I really don't play the accordion very well because I've stopped years ago, really. But anyway, I think it's fun that you got it, so thanks. But also, accordions come in different types. And concertinas, for example, come in Anglo and English. And the Anglo accordions play different notes on the in and out, and the English don't. And I play the English, and this is an Anglo. So I've got an excuse for being rubbish, so it's just, which is nice. So thanks for the excuse. So here we go. So just to illustrate, look, we get... Didn't sound too bad, did it, you see? There we go. All right, good. There we are. Maybe I'll play it again at the end if if it grabs it. Okay. So, predictive modeling. defensible predictive modeling enabled by advances in computational tools and so on. So I just want to illustrate that with respect to the terrestrial carbon cycle. This is work that my colleague Matthew Smith has just finished and finally got it published, I'm very happy to say, in Biogeosciences. And it's Biogeosciences has a phase where you can do public comment on it. So if anyone did want to comment on the work, positive or negative, I really believe there's no such thing as bad publicity. And actually, what we're really, as I hope I'll persuade you, what we're trying to do anyway with this project actually is to kickstart a spirit of people actually challenging each other's models and replacing bits and then showing that they can do better. So if this model gets entirely replaced with something better in a short time, then it will have been a success for us. So the carbon climate change problem, I mean, I think that it seems very familiar. CO2 levels are going up, and this is the beginning of the Industrial Revolution around here somewhere. No one's arguing with that. Well, no one's arguing that they're going up. I think some people actually argue that it's not us making them go up, which I think is amazing. But there we are. So then we have increasing temperatures and sea levels and so on. So carbon and climate change, quite familiar. And I think and probably a lot of the people in this room don't, but as in general, people often have this very simplistic picture of it, that cars and power plants put CO2 into the atmosphere, and this is like thickening the glass, and the world gets warmer, and off we go. But actually, when we put CO2 into the atmosphere, this is actually what's happening. So the carbon cycle is actually there's a lot more going on in the carbon cycle. It's a highly cyclic system, and we're perturbing it. So perturbing the carbon cycle is a lot more like doing something like quantitative easing, printing money and putting it into the circular flow model. That's not as simple as, if you print money, that doesn't necessarily make everyone richer, right? And in the same way, putting CO2 into the atmosphere actually doesn't necessarily make the world warmer. Please don't quote me, don't tweet that and nothing else. That would be really annoying if you did it. So this shows. So this diagram here shows, for example, I won't go into it in detail, but the world's vegetation actually cycles 10 times more CO2 every year than humans put into the atmosphere. So we put in so many units, but every year 10 times as much as that goes into the vegetation, but most of it comes back out. So it's a highly cyclic system. We can show a simpler view of that here. And there's something similar with the ocean. So here are fossil fuels going into the atmosphere as CO2, but that CO2 is being cycled in between vegetation and the soil on land, and in between the shallow and the deep ocean. And at the moment, the ocean is taking up about a quarter of our emissions, and the land is taking up about a quarter of our emissions. So together, the ocean and the land are actually soaking up half of our CO2. So the rate of CO2 increase is only half what it would be without the ocean and the vegetation. The question is, though, what's the future of these carbon sinks? Because CO2 also alters the climate, and all of these processes are sensitive to the climate. So, for example, we think the ocean pump will slow down in a warmed world because the temperature gradient between the equator and the poles will be less. But we're very uncertain about what might happen to the future of the terrestrial carbon sink, as it's called, which is mostly in forests. All we can do is try to predict that. So here are a bunch of models. And what you'll see is they tend to, this is showing a positive number here, means a net movement of CO2 into the vegetation from the atmosphere. So that's good. Up is good, and that's a brake on climate change. And down is bad, and it's an accelerator on climate change. And what we can see here is that the models agree that there's, that since 1950 there's been a moderate carbon sink. So that's what we know at the moment. When we go out into the future, some of them say that that sink just gets ever larger, so the vegetation acts as an ever more efficient brake on climate change. Whereas this model here, which happens to be the British model, is much more pessimistic and says that around a little bit before 2050, there's a big turnaround, and the vegetation actually becomes, year on year, these are annual changes, a net carbon source. And this uncertainty between these models, and that's because the Amazon's collapsing and turning into a savanna. And so the uncertainty between these models, what it means is then, it's not uncertainty to do with the climate impacts of CO2, it's actually uncertainty to do with the CO2 given CO2. That's why it's like the quantitative easing. It's how much of the CO2 we put in the atmosphere will stay there. And this uncertainty is currently the largest single source of uncertainty in future predictions of the climate, at least according to the IPCC in 2007. And what's for sure is that it is a major source of uncertainty. So what we decided to do then was to do a defensible model of the terrestrial carbon cycle in that narrow sense that I described earlier, which is one that's based on explicitly on data and Bayesian inference and so on, and makes predictions with uncertainty. So we assembled a bunch of data sets together, all of which, or most of which, are recommended by the IPCC for precisely this purpose, and yet, funnily enough, hadn't really been used to constrain carbon models before. And I want to call your attention to some of the numbers here. That's why I said sometimes, you know, different scientists are in very different regimes. And you hear about the data deluge, but these numbers here, they're not gigabytes or terabytes. These are numbers. These are kind of floats or doubles. So this one here, MPP, this is the net primary productivity. This is the rate of carbon that's going into the plants in the first place. We had 933 reliable estimates of MPP from around the world in different locations. And then so on. You know, this is measurements of soil carbon, 800 of them. The mortality rate of deciduous leaves, 30 numbers. And one of the things I often joke about is when you go to do these predictive models, what you really need is a heterogeneity of different data sources. And so what this means is this kind of the sort of data deluge question changes a bit, because you typically have a terabyte or gigabytes of something, but then you have, you know, a megabyte of something else, a kilobyte of something else. You've got 30 numbers for this, 2 numbers for this, and nothing for this final thing here. And we would give up 99% of the gigabyte for 3 numbers over in that column a lot of the time, because you're often limited in effect by whatever is missing. And I know that I'm sure that's come up before in the world of e-science. You know, there's very different science. A lot of the science is just based on one data set, in which case you can be faced with enormous data sets. But this kind of integrative modeling, we don't find as much data as you might have thought. I mean, having said that, of course, there are things, for instance, flux tower data, which in the next version of the model we'll be making use of, and there's enormous more flux tower data that we could put in. Okay, anyway, so we've assembled these data sets together, and each one is a point estimate of either a stock or a flow in the carbon cycle at a location from across the world. So the next thing we needed to do, though, that obviously the carbon cycle is fundamentally climate sensitive. So what we needed to do was take the key flows in the model and estimate them as functions of the climate. Now, this is one of these limiting steps which just really irritated me before I got to Microsoft, and irritated a lot of people, in the sense that there's a huge amount of quite reliable climatology, so climate statistics or historical climate data available. But available kind of means, you know, as enormous files that people have to download onto their computer and then learn to use esoteric libraries to get what they want out of it. Whereas, you know, at least down on the ground at the level I do my science, often we just want something like, well, can we just get the average annual temperature at that location? Or can we get the average summer temperature? Or can we get, you know, a time series for average temperature between this 5-year period? And extracting that kind of information out of these enormous data files is just a real pain. So we built this thing called Fetch Climate, which is a cloud service that runs on Azure that you can get to from inside any .NET program, that allows you to say, look, for this location, you know, Latlon, can you please just give me the annual average precipitation, let's say? And it goes off and chooses between multiple data sets. It does all the reinterpolation and regridding, etc., and just sends the answer back to you, along with the uncertainty and along with the list of the data sets that it used to fulfill the query. And it just takes out a really boring, enormously time-consuming step out of the things we do. And then it was my colleague Vasily who then had the idea of doing building a browser application on top of that API. And I'm just going to show you that here. So this is all freely available. I'll eventually get there. Here we go. So it's on top of Microsoft's Bing Maps, as it's called. And so it allows us to go in and out and switch to aerial view and all the rest. And so since we're in Chicago, for example, somewhere over here by this big lake, I think big's perhaps not quite the right word for it, but enormous lake. And then, and so for example, you know, we could put a grid over here, and we could say, well, show us a grid of the, say, the near surface wind speed, let's say. Whatever, you know, whatever's in this list. And this is something I should say we're very, very interested in getting people's views on the layers that they would like to see within Fetch Climate, because we're doing another push on it as part of this joint project with Research Connections. So we're interested in views on which information layers you'd like. As you can see, we can hover over here and have a look at how these numbers vary across space. I suppose if we wanted to, we could find out whether Chicago really is the windy city by comparing it with some other places. But for the science, what's more important, though, is that I was able to get the information that I needed very, very easily. You know, if I wanted to, I could instead put a point here and do a time series. If I do a yearly time series, oh no, let's do a daily time series, let's say, of something like air temperature. then this is going to give us a time, what we mean by that is time series index day by day. So this is going to give us our typical seasonal pattern of temperature in Chicago. You can hover over there and see that it goes between a little negative, this is degrees C in the winter, so fairly cold, and is that fairly warm in the summer? 21, pretty cool in the summer, right? Nice, cool weather. Alternatively, we could look at year by year patterns. And we could maybe extend this forward, I think it goes to 2009. And then we can have a look at how temperature has been changing through time, year on year in Chicago. I'm determined to do these demos live, but it always does make me a bit nervous. So come on now. I think I did put some weasel wording in there that says, please note, retrieval times can vary. See, I got out of it, so no one can get annoyed at me. But, all right, well, that's taking its time, but I hope you get the idea. Let's cancel that and do another one of those spatial searches for something like, say, precipitation. We could do a larger scale search. It would have got there in the end, by the way. It very, very rarely totally hangs or anything like that. It just takes time sometimes. Now, you can change the resolution on these grids and so on. You can download the data from the browser application, just as a CSV and so on. So we can hover over this. So the point is, so I could have used this as a scientist then to go and get the data that I wanted for my study through the browser. But one of the exciting things that we typically don't have at the moment in environmental sciences is repeatability in the use of that kind of driver data. Typically, it's described in a paper. I downloaded this data, I did this, I did that, and then I did the following. It's completely unrepeatable, and you have to believe what they say. Whereas an added benefit of something like this is I can actually take this URL here, and I can paste that into a paper. And then if someone clicks on that URL, then the fetch climate application, everything involved in it is there, so it'll actually spin up and repeat the fetch. So you've been able to get to exactly the same data set that I used just from a URL. Anyway, so that's fetch climate. So do give it a try, and we'd be very, very interested and grateful for ideas about anything. Any kind of feedback is great, but especially if there's particular layers that would be useful for your own work that you would like to see in there, broadly defined. It doesn't have to be climate. So we're planning on putting things like population density, demographics, noise, pollution, things like that. We're interested in human things too. So let's see. Ooh. Where are we? Yeah, no, that was the right place, right? So this is the model structure itself, and this applies at every location in space. And it's a stock and flow model, and what it shows is, for instance, this is the MPP, and that dictates the rate that the carbon comes down from the atmosphere. It's then allocated into stems, fine roots, and leaves. They then decay away at a certain rate into the soil, which has different fast and slow pools, and eventually that decomposes back into the atmosphere, and then there's fire in there as well that directly removes some of those and puts it into the atmosphere. And then in each of these shows the climate dependency of these processes. So this shows MPP and how it depends on temperature. So plants grow faster when it's warm and faster when it's wet. I mean, obviously the qualitative patterns here are not that surprising, and so on. And on it goes. So the idea is the stock and flow model. Now, it is a very simple model, and that's one of the things that we find when we try and do these defensible models, is that we tend to necessarily at least start with a simpler model that we can parameterize properly and understand against data and so on. So that's fine. So we could define the model structure. So we defined all of these, the actual mathematical forms of these were all taken from previous models that people had suggested in the community. But what we needed to then do was estimate the parameters for those functions. And that's, I've got another demo now. So we did that with a thing called Fillback. And I guess, I imagine a lot of people know what MCMC sampling is. And there are similar things like Gibbs sampling and so on. But the idea is that this is, I think it's probably been one of the most important computational advances for the science that I do, is that before these methods, we used to have a choice. If we wanted to fit a model to data, we had to choose a very, very simple, mathematically convenient form, like a general linear model or something. If we wanted to have a model that we thought was interesting and actually captured the way that reality worked, we couldn't fit that to data. So we had a kind of choice. But now with these, we have methods where we can take effectively any model, no matter how inconvenient, and fit it against a whole heterogeneous set of data. And by fit, I mean estimate the parameters. And of course, then we can do that for multiple data sets, multiple model structures, sorry. And in so doing, also, we can choose between the models. And it's a very kind of agreed recipe. It's a common currency of probability and likelihood. And there are, reasonable ways to choose between models. I mean, of course, there's not that there's no debate, but in general, there's a lot of agreement about that. So another one of the tools that we've built is called Fillback, because although MCMC sampling is a very easy method, a very sort of robust and forgiving method for fitting any model to any data, actually in talking to scientists, what I found was that most people couldn't do it in practice, that they spent a lot of time fiddling around and usually gave up, and those that didn't give up had to spend a lot of time to tailoring the MCMC algorithm to the problem at hand. And so we built a general MCMC tool called Fillback that sort of does all the kind of tuning and learning and distribution steps and all the rest for you. And so again, you can download that. We use it primarily from within Visual Studio. So it's a library that you call, you define your parameters, you define your likelihood function, a few other options, you hit go, and what you get back is your distribution of parameters, your AIC, BIC, DIC. You need multiple chains in parallel, and you get your convergence statistics and all the kind of stuff that you need to do this sort of defensible modeling. But then again, my enterprising colleague Vasily decided to build, mostly for the point of teaching, this web version, which I think is quite exciting by teaching. It was inspired by try F#, another connections project, which enabled people to program in F# in the browser. And so, here we go, model data and sampling gives you your parameters. And so you can choose your model form here, and they go from very, very simple, like a normal distribution, to something more interesting. You can see the source code. So this would be the code that would carry that model out if you did it in Visual Studio from C. But then it comes with some data sets. You can have a look at those and so on, with the how they're visualized, etc. But the point is then you can actually run the MCMC sampler. Whoa, when the mouse doesn't hang, here we go. So how MCMC sampling works is when you're trying to parameterize a model, if the model has, say, 10 parameters, you can view any parameter set as a point in 10-dimensional space. And the way MCMC sampling works is it takes a random walk in that space, a bit like an electron. But like an electron, it's not complete, it's a directed random walk, and it settles down to a cloud it spends its time in proportion to the probability, so it's very much like an electron orbital. So it will center itself on the most likely parameters, but it'll also very, very naturally estimate not only the uncertainty in A1, but the correlation in that space. And I can just show you that running here. So this is actually it tries out moves and accepts or rejects them. And so what it's doing, this is like the initial phase where the electron is coming in from out of the cold and is kind of coming into the orbit, if you see what I mean. But then after a while it settles down. We can have a look at that here. And after a while, this cloud of points becomes fairly stable. It reaches what we call quasi-equilibrium, and then this then is our posterior distribution, or these are samples from it. So again, you can learn about how Fillback works, how MCMC sampling works through this web page. As I'll show you in the last 3 or 4 minutes of my talk, though, because of advances like F# and try F#, we have the possibility actually of not just illustrating these sorts of analyses through a browser, but actually doing them in a browser. We can actually code the model and actually run the analysis in the browser, which is something I'll do before I'm done. So that's Fillback. So in short, then we're able to take those data sets, define a model structure, by which we mean the mathematical formulations of the climate dependencies of those flows. And we could then pull in a generic model fitting algorithm that lets us parameterize that whole model against all of those different data sets. And so again, that's what this is. So here, these lines are from the most likely set of parameters, the center of gravity of that electron orbital. But then the gray shows the uncertainty. And so that uncertainty then propagates obviously all the way through the model. So once we have that, we can then reapply the model on a fine grid across the whole of the world, which is what we've done here. So this is predicting the equilibrium. So there's a potential carbon storage across the world. It's highest obviously in areas where, like the tropical rainforests that have the highest carbon. But what's more novel about it really is that we're able to put error bars on those estimates. And they're very defensible, logically assigned error bars. And this shows that uncertainty relative to the mean. And so, because the error bars tend to be bigger where the mean is bigger, but if we normalize that out, we can actually find areas of the world like here where in relative terms we're much more uncertain about the carbon. And this is actually the forest grassland boundary in Africa, which is something that we thought we didn't understand very well. A lot of things change at that boundary. And so the uncertainty in those things combines in the model to give us a very large aggregate uncertainty. Because you can imagine the potential for these defensible in-court predictions of potential carbon storage with uncertainty in a world where we have red schemes, so carbon taxes, where nations are actually being rewarded for the carbon that they're protecting. There's one last thing, though. You might mention in that little Bayesian, you might remember in that Bayesian pipeline that I mentioned that it's not just about parameterizing one model, but choosing between them. And here we've used a sort of scheme where we've dropped in and dropped out different data sets and so on, and which I won't explain, to identify what we're calling the key structural uncertainty in the model. And that is that for all the other components, we get a consistent understanding of, so you see there's red and there's gray, and don't worry about what that is, but that's two different ways of using the data, and we tend to get the same answer, which suggests that the data, the model formulation for each process, and the way those processes are plumbed together are all consistent, with one exception, which is the rate of whole plant mortality, where depending on how we do it, we either conclude that that increases with, this is effectively temperature, is unresponsive to temperature, or decreases with temperature. So we actually get a qualitative difference. And that's propagated here. So when we project the future of the entire global terrestrial carbon cycle under climate change, a simulation where we assume it's at equilibrium now, which it isn't, but it's indicative, we can see that under one of those, we get a carbon sink that turns into a carbon source, on average, a lot like the UK Met Office model. That happens later. But then there's a substantial spread of uncertainty around this. But we can see that, however, if we use another one of these diversions for that plant mortality, we never see a carbon sink, and it just becomes a source straight away. And what this lets us do then is not only put yet more uncertainty on predictions, which is not that great, but we can then identify this as the key scientific priority for understanding the future of the terrestrial carbon cycle. So that now we've done this, we can say, when we put all this together, one thing jumps out as the most uncertain. And interestingly enough, it has received very little attention in the community. There's been a lot more attention on the ecophysiology of net primary productivity than there's been on the whole plant process of death. So a lot more on the gains, a lot less on the losses. And then finally, of course, we talked about the fact that we want to be able to communicate these things. This is something that our group, I think, has not put much emphasis on. But there is Worldwide Telescope, which I think you're probably familiar with. And I think that, where that comes in for us is that it gives us the potential to do a real kind of memorable sort of, oh wow, kind of visualization that gets people's attention. I know that one of the themes for the workshop is e-science in action. And I think, and in a sense, I suppose one of the themes of my talk has been e-science in context, and saying, we actually need to be able to communicate the results to the people that matter. And so Matthew, as part of this work, put together a Worldwide Telescope tour, which, again, I'm just running on my laptop here, and we've made extensive use of this video, so either running the tour or the video. So it's a little bit fast, but anyway, it's showing you that you have these different data sets, different point estimates around the world. This is MPP. I guess maybe it's not too fast when you're talking over it. And then other fluxes, so this one's looking at the total plant carbon, which is low in the north and high in other areas. There's fire frequency there, which peaks where we have high productivity but a long dry season, so fuel and fire, and so on, the other data sets. Plant mortality. And then this is a bit quirky, but anyway, he said, obviously, we integrated 12 such data sets. So by we, he means us, which is here. So my office is on the ground floor. It's just under the model, actually, but anyway. So that's obviously the model you've already seen. And then with that, we can then estimate the potential carbon storage all across the world. And you can just, obviously, I preach the converted here, because I'm sure they're all very familiar with Worldwide Telescope, but it just, it's a completely different form of communication and storytelling to what we used to be able to do in our science. Now, in the last 5 minutes, I wanted to show you a prototype of a tool. And because I think it shows the potential for how we could enormously accelerate this kind of predictive modeling, defensible predictive modeling of the environment. Now, the tool at the moment is called, but that name has been banned by Microsoft because it turned out when they did the searches that it's a trademark for software in China. So it's not really a good idea to have a piece of software with the same name as that. We can't find what it is, I believe. And I've already spoken with the people that are taking the video, and they know that they're going to, that will have just gone boop, 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 as if I'm swearing. And then they're going to blur out the word here. So please don't go and tweet the word or anything like that, or mention it to anyone. I'm probably taking a bit of a risk showing it to you, but come on, it'd be a shame not to. So what it is something that we put together. Let me go. which is another browser-based application, but that puts, it's like a slightly higher level that puts some of these pieces together, fetch climate, Fillback, dataset viewer, inside the browser. And what I'm going to do in the next 4 minutes, I'm going to use that to model the yield of wheat across the world and its relationship to temperature. So the idea is that, and this is being redone at the moment, we've got objects and actions. I don't have either at the moment. I'm going to start by doing an action called import CSV. I'm going to get something from my desktop, which is called, I've got it in a little folder called boop, and it's here. And so I've just created then, by doing that, I've created a table. I can put some notes on there, and there's the date and the time, and I can put extra fields and so on. So I've got metadata, I can name it, and so on. And I can go to the table and have a look at that table inside the browser. So fine, etc. But now I can spring off from that a visualization. And I'm just going to rename this thing. So I'm going to do visualize obs yield. So it's an action, visualize. And this thing knows by default that if it's long lat, it's going to assume that I want to see that on a map. So here are the points on a map then, and I've got my Bing maps all running within the browser and so on. But then I can color those points according to the yield of wheat. So I can straight away, in whatever it was, a minute or so, through a browser, start to look at how the wheat yield varies across the world. And if I go now to my provenance, we can see this thing tracks the provenance. We can rerun the whole start-to-finish pipeline that I've just done, no matter how complicated it is. So what I'm going to do now is and I'm going to go to that visualization and give it a sensible name, because otherwise you get confused. So map of obs yield will do. So that's fine. What I'm going to do now is instead spring off and do a fetch climate step. And this is going to go down that file that we just saw and look at each lat lon and hook out whatever I ask it to hook out with this little UI element here. So some fraction of the day, some fraction of the year, some range of years. I can force a data source if I want, or I can choose the default data source and so on. And that then has created my environmental data. So now supplemented that table of yield with air temperature. And I'm going to call this yield with temp for obvious reasons. And if I go back to my provenance now here, for example, I think we'll see that it's tracked the fact that I've done two separate things with my environmental data set. And then I can have a look at these separate objects here. Now I'm going to start again, and I'm going to create a new model. I'm going to call it wheat model. And I'm going to add a species. Now this is set up, so it has to be the same column name and so on. So obviously this is very much a prototype. And I'm going to add what's called, so it was set up for a particular domain called species distribution modeling, but this should really be relationship. So I'm going to give it a relationship with air temperature, Gaussian relationship. So here I can read about the functional form, and we could have comments and advice here, and so on. But what's happened there is that there was a little delay before that popped up, and the reason that these are the parameters that it's going to estimate in this model. Got 1 minute left, I think. And the reason that happened is because it's not just point-and-click modeling. So what was happening when I was clicking those is it was building this code in F#. And at any stage, I can switch to edit the code directly. And it's compiled in the browser. So that means I could put in principle, any model at all that I can program in a programming language, I can put inside there. So it could be a very complicated model. It doesn't have to be just point-and-click. But we'll stick with the point-and-click for now. So that's fine. So now I'm going to go back to my yield with temp file. I'm going to spring off a new model learning step. And to learn a model, I'm going to use it as the environmental data, use the yield as the response data, use that as the model structure. And I've now specified enough model structure and the input and output data to run an MCMC. And this is actually running the whole MCMC step here. When I built that model, by the way, you notice I didn't have to say what the parameters of the model are, and that's because the program infers that. So if I write a relationship, it looks in that function, it finds what's in the data, and anything that isn't in the data, it assumes must be a parameter to be estimated. So I don't even have to manually tell it what my parameters are. And this creates this set of samples on the posterior called a chain. I'm going to speed up now. So from those samples, I can go and extract, for instance, the mean. Remember, that's the center of gravity of that multidimensional space. That's my best guess is my parameter set. So here are my parameters here. And I can then use those parameters in a new simulation as the parameters. And the simulation needs the driver data again, so yield with temp, a model structure, and a parameter set. And that's enough then to create this synthetic data set here. Here's my synthetic data, and I can visualize that. So here I'm visualizing my predictions that are coming out of my model. And again, if I go to my provenance, obviously it's getting a bit more complicated now. But I get my visualization at the end, which is my... And then finally, I can use that thing in what we call a multi-view. There's panel 1. Panel 2, I can put in my map of observed yield. And what it lets me do then is side by side compare the model predictions, probably best called output at this stage, so it's been fit to that data, with the real patterns. And we can see straight away that it's not doing a very good job. I mean, everything here is, this is the real world, and this is something that just assumes a simple pump relationship with temperature. Obviously, what I could do now is I could go back. I won't, because I'll take too much of your time. But I could go back, hook out, for instance, precip, and ask if I then add an additional relationship with precip, do I get something that looks more like reality, and so on and so on. And so finally, if we look at the provenance then, we can see we started with a file. We were able to go in, supplement that with climate data without having to supply the data ourselves at all, just through a cloud service. We then built a model that related yield to temperature, fit that with MCMC. Remember that model, though it's simple at this stage, could be anything that you can write down in code. Estimate that model with MCMC sampling, which gave us parameters from which we extracted the mean. We did a simulation to get synthetic data, and we viewed all of that together in this multi-view. And the final thing here is that I can actually take all of this and archive it onto the SkyDrive, which is Microsoft's cloud sort of file storage system that some of you might use, analogous to Dropbox and Google Drive and so on. And then that means I could close my browser now, and then I can fly back home to Cambridge, open my browser, relink into the same SkyDrive folder, and I'm exactly where I am right now in front of you. And I can now, for instance, put in more data in the front end and see an improved prediction come out the back end. I could alter the climate in there to predict the potential response of wheat to climate change, and I could share my folder with you. Sorry, I should do that again. I could share my boop folder with you, and that would enable you then to pick up exactly where I'd left off. Have a look at my code, see if you agree. Do you think I've got it right? Would you like to change something? Would you like to put some more data? And so on. So it's very much not, I don't want to give you the impression that I'm sort of like ready to go for doing all the, it definitely isn't. But I do think I hope that it shows a sort of potential for how we can put some of these key pieces together to enable this sort of, this pipeline of kind of data through to predictive model with uncertainty, this defensible modeling pipeline. And on that note, I did just want to come back to point out that we have a new initiative now with, I say we, so we in Cambridge have a new initiative that's joint with our research connections colleagues in Redmond, Tony Hay and Kirsten in particular. And so, we're hoping that we can take some of these pieces together like this, but put it together with some of the things we really don't do. Like it'd be nice to have a push to worldwide telescope button here. It would be nice to be able to run high-powered computing off this somehow, which is something we can't do. Everything's client-side here. It's being run on the PC. Academic search, it'd be fantastic if we could get that involved. Layerscape is a community where we can share things and so on. So I think, we're just starting that at the moment, and we're quite excited about what we might be able to achieve. And I think, at least for that subset of that analysis, which is the defensible modeling pipeline, I think it shows potentially what we could do. But I'm 5 minutes over. So with that, I'll just say thanks very much. Cheers.
Okay, well, we are just a little bit over, but we do have these long breaks that I mentioned before. So if you have some quick questions, I'm happy to jog over and do my marathon, not as quick as Marty Humphrey, but to give you the mic. Okay. Oops. Oh, I missed here. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you very much for a beautiful talk, and I enjoyed very much. And one thing I would like to ask you is, how do you deal with defensive attitude of the majority for the defensible simulation? As in my case, I am responsible to select the worst scenario in case of Fukushima or for the tsunami. And the people has an attitude to select the convenient results, and ecological aspect is very important, but we need some sort of strategy. And have you started something like that?
I mean, I think it's really tough. I mean, one way that I think, you know, and although a lot of people feel this way about their papers, we did have a bit of trouble getting this published, the work, because I think that the immediate reaction of a lot of the people that saw it was the model's too simple. And really what they mean is it doesn't have the things in it that I like. And I mean, that sounds mean, but it's true. And because, you know, because if you're not doing this kind of model, you can kind of follow your nose, you can put in, you know, processes that are interesting. Of course, you should be doing that anyway. We've always stressed we should be exploring lots of avenues but you're exploring possibility. Whereas when you come down to saying, now can we make a kind of probability, a sort of, you know, defensible prediction, what you'll probably have to do is immediately, at least for the time being, go for a much simpler model. And one of the reviewers even said, actually, it was an interesting thing, he said, I'm all for simple models, but this one in not having ... in it is just too simple. So it was kind of, and it was like, oh, we know. And of course we stress so much that we want people to build off this model anyway. So I think that's right. I think it is a sociological challenge, really, because, you know, I think our ability to do defensible modeling has only appeared fairly recently. I mean, things like MCNC sampling, computation are really hungry because they need to run the model thousands of times under different parameter sets and so on. And so I think that, you know, as the models, the models we have now started a long time before that, and they've developed, and they're fantastic models, there's lots of interesting science in them. But sort of out of left field has come this alternative way of doing modeling, which tends to call for simpler models and so on. I think an interesting analogy is in epidemiology, where there are very different sorts of models that are used in epidemiology. There's some very interesting, complex, individual-based models, you know, with representation of the individual immune system, people moving around and so on. But every time there's a next outbreak, the models they use to make the predictions are much simpler, traditional SIR models that they fit against data. And I think maybe what we need to do in something like the earth sciences community is to recognize that split and to say, and I should say that doesn't mean nobody seems worried about the more complicated models, because what they think is that at some point they will become the best models at making predictions. And if you don't start building them now, you'll never have them. And I wonder whether we really ought to have that in the Earth system community, where we have models that we're building for the science to increase understanding, exploring possibilities, you know, etc. While at the same time, there's a slightly different kind of activity, which is taking bits of that and putting it together through this kind of Bayesian pipeline to make the best predictions we can right now. And that gets us out of some of the bind we have, where, you know, we can sort of say, you know, so it's a big complicated model, it's very uncertain, but that's okay because it's in the science, it's sort of science class of models. Whereas when the politicians then, you know, come and ask for a prediction, you say, well, no, these sorts of models, these are, you know, the next generation ones. If you want a prediction right now, you really want a current generation one, which is probably simpler, but will have gone through the Bayesian pipeline, and there you go. So I think maybe that split is what we need. But how to achieve that sociologically is quite tricky, because people have invested a lot in these models, and I think especially in a field like climate change, people are very, very cautious still about talking about uncertainties and problems and issues, and no one, you know, for all sorts of reasons, right? So it's very tricky, and I think that's something that, you know, we're finding in our group over the years, is that the technical side is fine, but, you know, the sociological side is so important, right? So.
Okay. I think what I'll do is I'll let them mob you at the break. How about that, Drew? Since we're about 10 minutes over time. So just if you are giving a demo today, I wanted to let you know that one brief announcement before you go to break is that at 4:30 in the foyer, you're going to be asked to give a lightning slide so that people know to come by and see your demo during the Demo Fest, which is going to be in the foyer at 4:30 this afternoon. Okay, thanks so much, Drew. That was a lovely talk.
Thank you.